A shamed son of his poor father introduces him as his chauffeur at school. He overhears and decides to keep quiet. But when the son returns home, he is paralyzed at the sight of what his father had planned. Juan Ramirez was a man of simple principles whose heart was divided between hard work as a gardener for a family of wealthy businessmen and unconditional love for his own family. Despite the financial difficulties he faced, his dedication to service was remarkable as he tended the lush gardens of the property with a care that reflected his soul. Widower for some years, Juan found comfort and companionship in the arms of a kind woman named Graciela Gonzalez. Although they were not married, they shared a solid and affectionate relationship that filled the void left by the loss of his wife. Together, they faced the challenges of daily life with courage and determination, finding strength in each other to move forward. With 3 children to raise, Juan had an even greater responsibility. Camila, the eldest, at 25 years old, was already working and building her career but still contributed to help with the household expenses. Her independent spirit and determination inspired Juan to never give up on her dreams. Pedro, at 22 years old, was in the final phase of university, looking for a promising future despite the family's financial difficulties. His passion for knowledge and his dedication to his studies were a source of pride for Juan, who strove to support him in his academic journey. Her 2 oldest children were dedicated and filled the father with pride. "Dad, I know that things are difficult, but do not worry so much. Pedro and I are managing to manage the costs of the university," said Camila. Looking at her father with affection while helping to prepare dinner, her eyes conveyed a mixture of gratitude and determination. Juan smiled at his oldest daughter, feeling an immense pride well up in his chest. "I know it, my daughter. But I cannot stop worrying about you. You are my treasures, and I will do everything whatever is within my reach to make sure that they have a bright future." While Camila stirred the pot, Pedro approached holding some books and notebooks from the university. "Dad, I'm going to class. Don't worry about me too. I will do my best to help with the expenses. We are a family and we will overcome any difficulty together." Juan looked at his son with a mixture of gratitude and tenderness. "Thank you, Pedro, you are the best children a father could wish for. You give me strength to keep fighting even in the most difficult moments." Finally, there was his youngest son, 18, who was about to finish high school and dreamed of getting a career in the business world. Santiago Ramirez had a striking appearance and a charming smile. He had a confident demeanor and a natural charm that made him popular among his schoolmates. However, behind his self-confident facade was a constant feeling of dissatisfaction and desire for more. Juan watched his youngest son worriedly, sometimes wondering where he had failed in his upbringing. Santiago always seemed to want more than they could offer, constantly seeking luxury and comfort many times without consequences for his desires. Juan tried to talk to Santiago about the importance of hard work and gratitude for what they had, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. One day, after another argument about the family expenses, Juan decided to approach Santiago differently, trying to understand the reasons behind his behavior. "Santiago Jr., I need to talk to you," began Juan with a serious expression on his face. Santiago looked at his father a little surprised by his direct approach. "What's wrong, Dad?" he asked curiously. "I've noticed that lately, you're very worried about material things. I want to understand what's going on, why you always want to have the most expensive and luxurious things," Juan inquired with a worried look in his eyes. He sighed, seeming uncomfortable with the conversation. "I just don't know, Dad. I just want to be like my friends, to have what they have. I'm ashamed of not being able to offer the same level of comfort that they have in their homes," he confessed, looking down at the ground. Juan put a comforting hand on Santiago's shoulder, transmitting his unconditional support. "I understand, son, but it is important to remember that material things do not define who we are. The true value lies in our kindness, in our efforts to help others, and in our ability to be grateful for what we have. You are a talented and special young man, Santiago, and you do not need to compare yourself to others to be happy," said Juan with tenderness in his voice. Santiago looked into his father's eyes, feeling a mix of emotions stir within him. "Thank you, Dad. I promise to try to be better, to try to be more grateful for what we have," he said with sincerity in his words. Juan smiled, feeling an immense pride overflow in his chest. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was determined to help Santiago find his true worth and learn to appreciate the simple things in life. One day, Juan's boss gave him an assignment. "Juan, I need you to take the family car and go to the building materials store. We need some items for the painting we will do in the house," said Juan's boss while adjusting his tie with an air of seriousness. Juan nodded, ready to fulfill another task assigned by his employer. He knew the importance of his work and the trust his boss placed in him. With a discreet smile, Juan thanked him and headed to the parking lot where the shiny family car was waiting for him. The sun shone in the sky, illuminating Juan's path while driving through the busy streets of the city. The cool wind blew through the car windows, bringing with it the soft scent of spring flowers. Juan felt grateful for the opportunity to drive such a luxurious car, even if it was only for a few moments. When he arrived at the building materials store, he parked the car carefully and entered the establishment, ready to make the necessary purchases. He walked through the aisles, examining the different products available and choosing carefully the items requested by his boss. With everything in hand, Juan made the payment and returned to the car, ready to go home and complete the assignment. He took the opportunity to return to drop Santiago off at school with the car, wanting to surprise him and show that he was capable of providing him comfort. "Santiago, today I will take you to school by car, okay?" said Juan with a kind smile on his face while he waited for his son to finish getting ready. Santiago, surprised by his father's offer, nodded without saying a word. He never expected that his father, whose humility was evident in his simple, worn-out clothes, could offer him a moment of luxury like that. He got into the car, still in disbelief at the surprise that his father had prepared for him. As he drove through the city, Juan felt a mixture of joy and nervousness. He wanted that experience to be special for Santiago, but at the same time, he was worried about his reaction. He thought about how he could take advantage of that moment to show his son that even with few resources he was still capable of providing him with comfort and care. "Wow, Dad, this car is amazing," Santiago exclaimed excitedly as he admired the vehicle's luxurious interior. Juan smiled happily to see the joy on his son's face. He drove carefully, appreciating the special moment with Santiago as they approached the school. Juan noticed a sudden change in Santiago's behavior. The enthusiasm gave way to a tense, thoughtful expression, and he became visibly quieter. "Santiago, are you okay? You seem different," Juan asked, worried about his son's sudden change of mood. Santiago hesitated for a moment, seeming to reflect on his words. Finally, he replied with a forced smile, "It's okay, Dad. I'm just a little tired, I think." Juan realized there was something else, but decided not to pressure his son at that moment. He continued driving in silence, worried about what could be bothering Santiago. When Juan's car arrived in front of the school, the weather between him and Santiago suddenly changed. Santiago, normally so expansive and effusive, seemed to be in a world apart, immersed in his thoughts. He barely looked at his father when he got out of the car, murmuring a quick, "Thank you," before hurrying away towards the school entrance. "Santiago, are you okay?" asked Juan, worried about the rush and the lack of communication from his son. He replied, "I have an exam, I'm in a hurry," and continued on his way without looking back. Juan watched him leave with a knot of worry forming in his stomach. Something was not right, and he felt it deep inside his being. After Santiago disappeared inside the school, Juan stood for a moment undecided about what to do next. For some inexplicable reason, he felt a strong intuition that he needed to go back and check if everything was okay with his son. So he decided to turn around and pass in front of the school again. As he approached, he saw Santiago in front of the school and was confused because he had said he was in a hurry. Juan could not help but notice the animation of Santiago, who was talking animatedly with his classmates as if he didn't have a care in the world. He frowned, confused by the disparity between Santiago's behavior inside and outside the car. "Santiago," called Juan, lowering the car window to communicate with his son. "I thought you had an exam. Why are you out here talking instead of being in the classroom?" Santiago turned around, surprised to see his father's car again. His face, before full of joy, now showed an expression of confusion and nervousness. "I'm coming, don't worry," replied Santiago, visibly uncomfortable. One could perceive the hesitation in his voice and the fleeting glances he exchanged with his friends as if he were trying to find a quick excuse. Juan was not convinced. He could feel that there was something else going on, something that his son was not sharing with him. Determined to discover the truth, he decided to confront Santiago later when they were alone. Juan said goodbye to his son with a gesture of his hand, rolling up the car window as he continued on his way. However, something made him stop for a moment. He lowered the window just enough to hear the distant voices of Santiago and his friends approaching. "Who is that man?" asked one of Santiago's friends, looking curiously in the direction of your father. As they approached, Santiago hesitated for a moment before answering. "He is my driver," said Santiago, and the weight of his words hit Juan like a punch in the stomach. Santiago's lie, it echoed in his mind, leaving him stunned and hurt. He never imagined that his son would lie about their relationship, about who he was to him. Juan felt a mix of sadness and disappointment settling in his chest as he finally rolled up the car window and continued on his way. That brief exchange of words between Santiago and his friends echoed in his mind throughout the ride home, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He wondered what he had done wrong, how he had failed as a father for his son to feel the need to lie about their relationship. Juan knew he needed to talk to Santiago about that lie, but he also knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation. Juan drove to his boss's house with his mind flooded with a mix of feelings regarding his son. Santiago reflected on the harsh words they had exchanged. "I'm just the driver," he muttered to himself, feeling a deep pain in his chest. "After everything I've done for him, after all the sacrifices I've made," he reflected, wondering to himself. As the car drove down the dark road, Juan found himself reliving every moment of his relationship with Santiago. He remembered the childhood days when they played together in the yard and the years of hard work to make sure his son had everything he needed. "I always did the best I could for him, but it never seems to be enough," he thought with a lump in his throat, the feeling of disappointment and dread growing inside Juan, weighing like an anchor on his heart. He wondered what he could have done differently to prevent Santiago from getting so far away from him. He wanted so badly for him to know how much he loved him, but it seemed like it was never enough. He murmured, feeling the tears burning in his eyes as the car approached his employer's house. Juan knew he had a difficult conversation ahead of him. He needed to confront Santiago about his lies and try to understand what was going through his mind. After a long day of work at his employer's house, Juan finally came home, still with a heavy heart and mind filled with thoughts about Santiago. He felt exhausted not only physically but emotionally as well. His son's words still echoed in his head, leaving him restless and worried. He sat at the small kitchen table where he usually made his meals, trying to find some comfort in the family routine. While he absent-mindedly stirred the food he had prepared, his mind wandered through memories of the sacrifices he had made for his children. "There must have been something I did wrong," he thought, the voice of doubt whispering in his mind. "I gave my all so that he would have a better life, but it seems that Santiago doesn't understand that." Juan sighed deeply, feeling the weight of frustration and sadness accumulate on his shoulders. While Juan was lost in his thoughts, the silence of the house was interrupted by the sudden sound of the phone ringing. He raised his head, surprised by the unexpected ringing. The phone on the kitchen wall seemed like a strange presence in that moment of reflection. He hesitated for a moment, imagining who could be calling so late. Who could it be at this hour, he thought, feeling a slight discomfort spread through his chest. Juan slowly got up from the chair, walking towards the telephone. The continuous sound of the ringer seemed louder with each step he took. With a trembling hand, he took the receiver and brought it to his ear. "Hello," he said, trying to keep his voice firm despite the uneasiness he felt inside. The answer that would come next could change everything, but he did not know it yet. "Good night, Juan." "It's Dr. Salazar," the voice on the other end of the line answered. He immediately recognized the name and voice of the lawyer who had already helped the family on a few occasions in the past. "It's late. Is everything okay?" Juan asked, now with a mix of concern and curiosity. "I'm sorry to call at this hour, Juan. But I have some important news for you. We need to talk about your Uncle Roberto," the lawyer said in a serious and professional voice. "My Uncle Roberto?" Juan was confused. He hadn't spoken to his uncle for years. "What happened to him?" "I'm sorry to inform you, but your Uncle Roberto passed away recently," said Dr. Salazar, pausing so that the news could be assimilated. "He had no wife or children, and you were his only close relative. He left you his entire inheritance." Juan turned pale and stunned by the news. The unexpected call seemed surreal, as if it were part of a strange dream. "The entire inheritance," he repeated incredulously. "But he was a millionaire." "Yes, he was," confirmed Dr. Salazar. "And all his fortune, properties, and businesses now belong to you." He felt his legs weaken and needed to lean on the kitchen table to keep from falling. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his mind struggling to process the information. "I understand that it's a lot to take in, Juan," said Dr. Salazar in a soft voice. "Can we meet tomorrow to discuss the details, and start the transfer process? I want to make sure that everything is done correctly and legally." "Yes, of course, Dr. Salazar." "Tomorrow," Juan replied, still stunned. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't worry about it. Now, Juan, rest, and tomorrow we'll talk more. I'm very sorry for your loss. But I hope this inheritance can bring some stability to you and your family," the lawyer said before he hung up. He stood in the kitchen holding the phone in his hand as the enormity of the news loomed over him. His Uncle Roberto, the distant millionaire he barely knew, had left him his entire fortune. The feeling of unreality still hung in the air as he slowly placed the receiver back in its place, trying to come to terms with the impact of that monumental revelation. He looked around the modest kitchen, reflecting on how his life could change drastically. He thought about his children, especially Santiago, and how this unexpected inheritance could affect their lives. He sat back down at the table, now without appetite, his mind running in 1,000 directions. The future that before seemed uncertain and full of struggles suddenly transformed into something completely new and unfamiliar. Santiago came home, throwing his backpack on the couch with a careless gesture. Juan, who was in the kitchen, watched his son for a moment before entering the living room. He felt the weight of the conversation he needed to have, but he knew it was necessary. "Santiago, can we talk?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Santiago looked at him and shrugged, sitting on the sofa. "Of course. What's wrong?" Juan approached and sat in a chair in front of his son. "Are you ashamed of me?" Santiago asked directly, looking into his son's eyes. Santiago hesitated, looking away. "It's not that, Dad," he murmured without much conviction. "Then you are ashamed of being poor," insisted Juan, trying to understand what was going through his son's head. Santiago lowered his head, avoiding his father's gaze. "I just don't want people to think we are poor. That's all." Juan sighed deeply, feeling a lump in his heart. "Money is not everything, son. We must love our family regardless of our financial situation." But Santiago, instead of reflecting on his father's words, began to speak rudely and coarsely. "You should try harder to stop being a gardener. I'm ashamed of you. Yes, it's humiliating to be seen with someone who works in that." Juan felt the pain of the words like a blow. "I know, Santiago. I heard you saying that I was your driver, and that hurt me a lot." "Do you have something to tell me?" he asked, hoping that his son would show some remorse. Santiago simply shook his head without showing any remorse. "You have to understand my point of view, Dad. It's not easy for me either." Those words hurt Juan deeply. He stood up, looking at his son with an expression of sadness and determination. "Santiago, I'm going to teach you a lesson." After a few hours, Camila and Pedro arrived home, bringing with them an atmosphere of normality after a long day of work and study. Juan, still affected by the conversation with Santiago and by the news he had received, decided it was time to gather everyone for an important conversation. "Children, I need to talk to you in the living room," said Juan, trying to keep his voice firm, but his tone betrayed a bit of his anxiety. Camila and Pedro, noticing the seriousness in their father's voice, exchanged curious glances but accepted without a problem. Santiago, on the other hand, was still upset by the previous conversation and did not want to participate. "I do not want to go," said Santiago, crossing his arms stubbornly. Juan took a deep breath and walked to Santiago's room. "Santiago, you need to come to the living room. The news I am going to give will change our family. You must be there." Reluctantly, Santiago followed his father to the living room, sitting on the couch with a closed expression. Camila and Pedro were visibly confused and worried, trying to guess what could be so important. "So what's going on, Dad?" asked Camila, breaking the silence. "I got a call from Dr. Salazar, our lawyer," Juan began, his voice full of contained emotion. "He informed me that my uncle Roberto passed away recently." Before Santiago could continue, he interrupted him with his eyes wide open. "That millionaire?" Juan nodded. "Yes, Santiago, that millionaire." Santiago immediately showed a sparkle in his eyes, a flash of hope and greed that Juan could not ignore. He was excited with the news of the inheritance and began to plan how to spend the money. Meanwhile, Camila and Pedro were still processing the news without knowing exactly how that would affect their lives. "Dad, what does this mean for us?" Pedro asked cautiously. "Uncle Roberto decided to leave me the entire inheritance," he said, feeling a lump in his throat. "Santiago, that millionaire?" Santiago exclaimed with a wide smile. Juan maintained a serious expression without sharing the euphoria of his youngest son. "Yes, it's true. But there's something else I need to tell you. The decision I've made about this inheritance is not going to please everyone." Camila and Pedro exchanged worried glances, while Santiago seemed not to grasp the seriousness of the situation. "How so, Dad?" asked Camila, trying to understand what was to come. "I have decided that you two, Camila and Pedro, will have the right to enjoy this inheritance with me," declared Juan, looking directly at his older children. "You were never ashamed of me. You always respected me and supported me regardless of our financial situation." Santiago turned pale, happiness quickly disappearing from his face. "And I?" he asked, his voice beginning to fail. Juan looked at his youngest son with a mixture of sadness and firmness. "Santiago, you will not receive anything from the inheritance. This is a lesson for you, for having lied to your schoolmates and saying that I was your driver." Camila and Pedro were in shock. "Santiago, how did you have the courage to do that to our father?" Pedro asked incredulously. "We always told you that we should feel proud of our father," added Camila, shaking her head in disapproval. "How could you be so?" Santiago lowered his head, avoiding the glances of his brothers. "I just didn't want my friends to know," murmured his voice almost inaudible. Juan sighed, feeling the pain of disappointment. "I worked hard all my life to give you the best I could. I was never ashamed of my work, and seeing you despise it was very painful." "Dad, I..." began Santiago, but his father interrupted him. "No, Santiago. You need to understand that money isn't everything. Respect and love for family are more important. Maybe one day you'll learn this, but for now, you'll have to live with the consequences of your actions." The room was silent for a moment, each one processing the revelation and Juan's decision. Camila and Pedro approached their father, offering him comfort and support. Santiago, on the other hand, felt isolated, realizing the weight of his actions. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Santiago said finally, his voice breaking. "I hope you understand." "One day, Santiago," answered Juan with a mixture of sadness and hope. "But for now, let's move forward and learn from our mistakes. Thank you for the support, my children. You are my pride." Turning to Santiago, Juan continued with a firm tone, "Santiago, from now on, you will learn the value of work and respect. There will be no more excuses, and if you want to have expensive things, you will have to work for them, as I have always done." With these words, Juan stood up, ending the conversation. Camila and Pedro remained at their father's side, while Santiago was left alone, reflecting on the hard lessons he had just learned. The next day, he woke up with a heavy heart but determined to move forward with his plans. He knew he had to reward Camila and Pedro for the respect and support they had always shown. After breakfast, he left home and went to the nearest car dealership. The salesman greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" "Two cars," he replied bluntly, "one for my daughter Camila and one for my son Pedro. They deserve it." The salesman was surprised but quickly recovered and began to show the available options. After a few hours of negotiations and careful choices, Juan finally left the dealership with two new cars ready to be between his children. Back home, he parked the cars in the garage and went inside. Calling Camila and Pedro, "Camila, Pedro, come outside for a moment please," said Juan, trying to contain his anger. With emotion in his voice, the two came out curious and a little confused. When they saw the cars, their mouths dropped open. "Dad, what is this?" asked Camila, surprised. "Are they our cars?" answered Juan, smiling. "They deserve it for all the support and respect they have always given me." "Dad, this is incredible." "Thank you very much," exclaimed Pedro, hugging his father with gratitude. "I don't even know what to say, Dad." "Thank you very much," added Camila, also excited. Santiago watched the scene from afar with an expression of envy and resentment. He could not believe that his brothers were receiving so much while he was left out. The feeling of injustice grew within him. Although he knew deep down that he had caused his situation, Juan turned to Santiago who was standing at the door observing everything in silence. Santiago approached slowly, trying to hide his frustration. "Dad, this is very generous of you," he said, his voice betraying a tone of envy. Juan looked at his youngest son with a serious expression. "Santiago, I want you to understand that this is a gesture of recognition for the respect that your brothers have always had for me. I hope you can learn something from this." Santiago simply nodded, not knowing what to say. He felt humiliated and excluded, but he could not deny that his behavior had led him to that situation. Juan continued with his plans, determined to help Camila and Pedro in every way possible. He took the phone and made some calls to his children's universities, making sure that all the overdue monthly payments were paid. Later that afternoon, Juan called his children back to the living room. "Camila, Pedro, I have one more thing for you," said Juan, feeling proud to be able to help his children. "I am going to buy an apartment for each one of you. I want you to have your place where you can start your lives with comfort and security." Camila and Pedro were almost speechless. "Dad, this is too much." "I don't know how to thank you," said Camila, with her eyes full of tears. "We are very grateful, Dad." "You didn't have to do all this," added Pedro, taking his father's hand. "I know I didn't have to do it, but I want to do it." "They deserve it," Juan replied with a warm smile. Santiago, sitting in a corner of the room, observed the scene with a mixture of sadness and envy. He felt the weight of his actions and the distance he had created between him and his father. The gratitude of his brothers made him feel even worse, and he did not know how to fix the situation. "Dad, began Santiago, but Juan interrupted him. "Santiago, I hope that one day you understand what is important in life. It is not material goods but respect and love for the family. Even you have a lot to learn." Santiago remained silent, reflecting on his father's words. He knew he had a long way to go to regain the trust and respect of his family. After a long and difficult day, Juan decided he needed to talk to Marta, his girlfriend. He was eager to share the recent changes in his life, hoping this could be a turning point for both. Marta was a domestic worker, a humble, hardworking, and honest woman. Her personality was very similar to that of Juan's, and they had been dating for 2 years, always supporting each other. When Juan arrived at Marta's house, he felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. He knew that the news he had to share would change everything. "Marta, I need to tell you something important," said Juan, holding her hands firmly. "What's wrong, Juan?" "You seem nervous," Marta replied, worried and curious at the same time. "My uncle Roberto passed away, and he left me the entire inheritance," Juan explained with a shy smile. "This means that my family is doing well financially. Now, we don't need to worry about money anymore." Marta was surprised, but an expression of relief and happiness soon appeared on her face. "That's wonderful, Juan. I'm so happy for you," she said, hugging him tightly. "You deserve it." Juan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that it was the right time for the next step. "Marta, I want to take advantage of this moment to ask you something very important," he said, with his heart racing. "Do you want to marry me?" Marta was stunned for a moment, her eyes filled with tears of joy. She always knew that she loved Juan, but she didn't expect him to ask that question so soon. "Yes, my love. Of course, I want to marry you," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. Juan felt a wave of relief and happiness. He knew that Marta was the right person for him, and now, with the inheritance, he could provide a better life for both of them. He was already thinking of a date. "What do you think if we get married next month?" "It would be perfect," exclaimed Marta. "I can't wait to start this new stage of our lives together." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans and dreaming of the future. Juan knew that despite all the challenges and difficulties, he had finally found happiness with Marta. But the couple's joy was short-lived. The inheritance from his uncle Roberto had changed everything, but Santiago's behavior weighed on his mind. Ever since Juan announced his engagement to Marta, Santiago kept hinting that Marta was only interested in money. Juan knew that wasn't true. Marta had always been by his side in good times and bad, long before he became a millionaire. "Dad, don't you see? She only wants your money," said Santiago, entering the room with a look of disdain. "Santiago, Marta is a good woman. She was with me when I had nothing," answered Juan, trying to stay calm. "You have to understand that." "I don't believe it, Dad. You are so naive. When they get married, she will have the right to half of the inheritance. That is fair. I am your son. I should have that right," continued Santiago, raising his voice. Juan felt anger rising inside him, but he knew he needed to control himself. He stood up and faced Santiago. "Santiago, Marta is not interested in my money. She loves me for who I am, not for what I have," Juan tried to explain, but he saw that his words did not reach his son. The days passed, and the tension between Juan and Santiago only increased. Santiago continued trying to poison the relationship, spreading rumors and creating conflicts. Marta, although hurt, remained firm at Juan's side, understanding the difficult situation he faced with his son. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The church was beautiful, decorated with flowers and soft lights. Juan was nervous but happy. He knew he was making the right decision by marrying Marta. Everything was going well until suddenly Santiago entered the church, visibly furious. "I'm not going to allow you to marry her," Santiago shouted, interrupting the ceremony. The guests were shocked, and a heavy silence fell over the church. Marta looked at Santiago with tears in her eyes, while Juan felt his heart breaking. "Santiago, please don't do this," Juan pleaded, trying to stay calm. "She will keep half of the inheritance. That's not fair. I am your son. I have the right to that money," Santiago continued, his voice full of rage and envy. Juan looked at his son with sadness and desperation. He knew he had to be firm. "Marta was already with me when I was poor. She never worried about money. She loves me for who I am, not for what I have," said Juan, trying to make Santiago understand. "Don't you see, Dad? She is cheating on you," yelled Santiago, the words cutting like knives. Marta began to cry, unable to bear the unfair accusations. Juan took her hand and turned to Santiago. "Stop, Santiago. You are wrong, and you need to accept it," spoke Juan firmly. "Marta is my wife, and you have to respect that." Santiago, seeing that he could not convince his father, left the church furious. The wedding continued, but the shadow of Santiago's words floated over the event. Juan and Marta exchanged vows, promising to support each other in good times and bad. "We are here to support you," added Pedro. Juan smiled, grateful for the support of his children. He knew that the situation with Santiago would not be easy to resolve, but he was determined to keep his family together. While Marta and Juan danced their first dance as husband and wife, he whispered in her ear, "I love you, Marta. Nothing will separate us. I love you too, Juan. Together, we can face anything," Marta replied, hugging him tightly. The night continued with moments of joy and celebration, but Juan knew that he would need to find a way to reconnect with Santiago and heal the wounds that had been opened. He was determined to do it, not only for himself but for the entire family. Juan thought that after the scandal of the wedding, Santiago would calm down. But he was wrong. His youngest son gave him another point on the back. Then Santiago went to Pedro and Camila to talk. "Dad, we need to talk," said Santiago, calling his brothers to the living room where his father was visibly tense. Pedro and Camila exchanged worried glances before sitting in front of their brother. They could feel the seriousness in the air as they waited to hear what Santiago had to say. "What's wrong, Santiago? Did something happen?" Pedro asked, with an apprehensive expression on his face. Santiago took a deep breath before starting. He knew that this conversation wouldn't be easy, but he needed his brothers to be aware of the situation. "I was thinking, maybe it would be better for all of us to annul the marriage between our father and Marta," Santiago began, trying to choose his words carefully. Pedro and Camila's eyes were surprised by their brother's proposal. They exchanged confused glances before Camila spoke. "Santiago, what are you saying? Why should we annul the marriage? Marta is a wonderful woman, and they love each other," said Camila, trying to understand the logic behind Santiago's suggestion. Santiago sighed, feeling frustrated. He thought his brothers would give him his concern, but it seemed they were against him. "No, they understand that if we annul the marriage, we will have a better chance of guaranteeing our share of the inheritance. Dad and Marta do not need that money, but we have a right to it," Santiago tried to explain, but Pedro interrupted him. "Santiago, that is not right. You are being greedy. Marta is Dad's wife and has every right to be by his side. We cannot sacrifice her happiness for money," Pedro said firmly, his voice reflecting his conviction. Santiago felt defeated. He had expected his brothers to support him, but now he realized that he had made a mistake. He lowered his head, knowing that he could not force them to agree with his decision. Then Santiago made another decision. "Dad, I need to talk to you," he said, entering the living room where his father was sitting reading a newspaper. Juan looked up, surprised by the seriousness on Santiago's face. He could feel the tension in the air as his son approached. "What's wrong, Santiago? Did something happen?" Juan asked, worried by his son's serious expression. "I took a decision. I hired a lawyer. I'm going to start a process against you to claim part of Uncle Roberto's inheritance, said Santiago, looking directly into his father's eyes. Juan's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. After everything they had been through as a family, Santiago was willing to take the dispute to court. Santiago, you can't do this. You know that Uncle Roberto left the entire inheritance to me, Juan tried to argue, but Santiago seemed determined. I don't care, Dad. I have the right to that inheritance as much as you do. I'm not going to give up until I get what's rightfully mine, Santiago replied with firm and decisive words. Juan felt a mixture of emotions go through him. He was disappointed with Santiago's attitude, but he also wondered where he had failed as a father. Santiago, you're acting impulsively. Please, let's talk about this before making any hasty decisions, he asked, trying to stay calm. I have the right to that inheritance as much as my brothers. It's not fair that they leave me out just because I don't agree with your decisions, Santiago replied, crossing his arms defensively. Juan sighed, feeling disappointed with Santiago's stubbornness. He tried to argue and explain that things were not as simple as his son thought, but Santiago was determined. I understand your concerns, Santiago, but you have to understand that my decision was based on valid reasons and justice agreed with me, Juan said with a touch of sadness in his voice. Santiago tensed up. Hearing his father's words, he knew that he was not going to get the result that he expected, but he did not expect to feel so defeated. I will do whatever it takes to get my part of the inheritance. I will not give up so easily, said Santiago, leaving the room with anger in his heart. Juan watched his son leave, feeling a deep sadness seeing how the relationship between them deteriorated even more. He only hoped that one day Santiago would understand his reasons and could forgive him, but Santiago was determined. He turned his back on his father and left the room, leaving Juan alone with his thoughts. Juan felt discouraged. He never imagined that his son would turn against him in that way. Sadness and disappointment weighed on his heart as he wondered how to deal with that situation. In the courtroom, the tense atmosphere was palpable. Juan and Santiago's lawyers were preparing to present their arguments to the judge. Juan's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a firm stance, began to speak in defense of his client. Your Honor, Mr. Juan Ramirez is a hard-working man, dedicated to his family and his profession. He has built his life with honesty and effort, and the decision to divide his inheritance among his older children was based on solid moral and family values, said the lawyer, looking directly at the judge. Meanwhile, Santiago's lawyer, a determined young man, stood up to present his case. Your Honor, my client Santiago Ramirez is the youngest son of Juan Ramirez and also deserves to benefit from his father's inheritance. He is entitled to a fair share, and the decision to exclude Santiago was unfair and should be reviewed, argued the young lawyer with conviction in his words. The judge, a serious and impartial man, listened attentively to the arguments of both sides. After careful consideration, he made his decision based on the arguments presented and after carefully analyzing the situation. The decision of Juan Ramirez to leave his inheritance to his older children is legitimate and is by the law. Santiago Ramirez has no right to his father's inheritance, announced the judge, concluding the hearing. Juan felt a mixture of relief and sadness upon hearing the decision. He knew it was the right thing to do, but it still hurt to see his son being denied. Santiago, on the other hand, was enraged by the decision and left the room, slamming the door, further fueling the resentment that already existed between him and his father. Juan returned home with a heavy heart after the hearing. When he walked through the door, he saw Marta in the kitchen preparing dinner. He approached her, still carrying the tension of the legal battle. We had the hearing today, Juan said, his voice full of concern. Marta turned to him, her eyes full of compassion. She knew how difficult this process had been for Juan and the entire family. How was it? She asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Juan sighed deeply before answering. The judge decided in favor of my older children. Santiago will not receive anything, he said, regret in his voice. Marta hugged him tenderly, trying to comfort him the best way she could. "Everything will be okay, Juan. We are together in this," she said, caressing his face. While they were talking, Santiago entered the room and watched them for a moment before turning his back and going up the stairs. Juan noticed his son's presence and felt a mixture of sadness and frustration when he saw him walk away without saying a word. Santiago murmured, but his son had already disappeared. Marta looked worriedly in the direction Santiago had gone and then turned her gaze to Juan, knowing that there was much more to resolve than just legal issues. Juan finally made a decision. The tension in his house had become unbearable, and he knew he needed to move on with his life. After buying a house, he prepared to move in with Marta, his beloved. Pedro and Camila had already followed their paths, living in their apartments, and now it was Juan's turn to do the same. "Santiago, we need to talk," said Juan, calling his son for one last conversation before his departure. Santiago looked at his father, his eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions. He knew that this conversation would be difficult, but he also knew that it was inevitable. "What's wrong, Dad?" he asked cautiously. Juan took a deep breath before starting to speak, his words heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "Santiago, this is your inheritance. This house will be your responsibility now. You are going to take care of it, keep it clean, and pay all the bills. This is the inheritance that I want to leave you," explained Juan seriously. Santiago remained silent for a moment, processing his father's words. "I understand, Dad. I will take care of the house," Santiago finally answered, his expression showing a hint of understanding. Juan nodded, knowing it was time to move on. He said goodbye to Santiago with a big hug before leaving for his new life. Santiago was beaming with the news that he would have his own house. He imagined the freedom of independence he would have, away from the rules and restrictions of his father. However, as the days went by, he began to realize the responsibilities that came with this new stage of life. Before, he had never had to worry about bills or financial management. Now, he was the one who had to deal with all that. "I never imagined it would be so complicated to maintain a house," Santiago commented to himself while trying to organize his finances. Reality began to weigh on his shoulders. He realized how much his father worked to support the family and provide them with a comfortable life. He had never thought about that before. Now, he was facing the same difficulties, trying to balance the budget and pay all the bills. As Santiago began to better manage his finances and appreciate his father's hard work, each bill payment was a reminder of his father's sacrifice and dedication to the family. Little by little, Santiago began to understand the true meaning of responsibility and gratitude. Santiago remained in poverty while he watched from afar the life of his father and his brothers. It was difficult not to feel bitter seeing how his choice had distanced him from the family and placed him in a difficult situation as he struggled to survive with few resources. Reflecting on his past attitudes, he realized how wrong he had been. However, he knew that he could not change the past, only learn from it. "How could I be so selfish and naive?" Santiago muttered to himself as he watched his father return from work. He saw his father's dedication to supporting the family and his brother's efforts to build their lives. It was painful to recognize that he had contributed to his current situation. Despite this perception, it also brought a new understanding of the consequences of his actions. "I have made wrong decisions, but now I must face the consequences," Santiago told a friend, expressing his resignation to reality. As the days went by, Santiago looked for ways to get up and rebuild his life. He accepted that the road to redemption would be long and difficult, but he was determined to move forward. "Maybe I was wrong, but I can still make things work out," Santiago told himself, nourishing the hope of a better future. In solitude and financial difficulties, Santiago found himself facing a forced introspection. The days passed slowly, not only filled with a shortage of resources but also with the absence of company and the weight of responsibilities that until then he had never faced. In those moments of silence, the voices of the past resonated in his mind, bringing back memories of his hasty actions and the consequences of his mistakes. The lack of resources forced him to reconsider his priorities and face the consequences of his actions. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Santiago embarked on a journey of self-transformation. He acquired a new perspective on life and his priorities, learning to value each small achievement and to face challenges with courage and determination. Even in the darkest hours, he found within himself an inner strength that drove him to continue forward with humility and perseverance. Santiago promised not to repeat the mistakes of the past, embracing the opportunity to shape his future with his own hands. If you liked this story, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing wonderful stories like this. And now on your screen a new story will appear. We are very happy to have you here with us. A hug, and until the next video.